Also this week, the NCAA Football Rules Committee will be meeting, and there's a lot of things that they're going to be taking into consideration. We are going to be looking at, I don't know, the latest changes to targeting. They're going to be looking at the latest changes to replay. We're going to be going back to see how the new clock rules ended up adjusting things. And Tom, I know that over at CBSSports.com, you put together a column that was very much at trying to sharpen the focus of where these guys should be looking in terms of trying to improve the overall sport of football. This sport continues to change both on the field and off the field in rapid ways. So clearly we can make changes and just plow ahead into the new future. Where do you think that the NCAA Football Rules Committee should be turning their attention?
I think overall, the problem with the NCAA Rules Committee is they're too reactionary. Like, people complain about something, so they decide we have to change it in the offseason, which is fine, because if it should be changed, change it. I just don't think they are proactive enough in figuring some things out. But what I wrote about, and it's something we discussed last season as the year was going on, because there were some key moments. I used the Hail Mary at the end of Virginia Tech and Miami as my, going off point here. But when it comes to replay reviews, we have seen officials who don't see what happened because they can't. They're forced to make calls on the field, and then they go to review. And despite any possible evidence that suggests they may be wrong, since there's no definitive evidence of their guess, which is what it is, then the ruling stands. They can't overturn it. But we also saw last year a penchant for refs in these situations to kind of look past that. And they're like, listen, it's more important we just get the call right. So my suggestion is just get rid of the rule that says they have to make a call. Like, if they don't see what happened, like, was it a catch? Was it incomplete? Was it a fumble? If it's in a scrum, like, and you can't see it, just say, we don't know, man. Like, if you look, like, the Big Ten last year opened a giant replay review center in Rosemont, Illinois. All these conferences are building these centers where they can, there's centralized replay review systems. You've poured money into these things, use them. Like, if you have angles that the refs don't, let them go to the monitor, let them collaborate and figure it out what the most likely scenario is. You're still going to get calls wrong, but you're getting calls wrong now. At least that way you're not putting yourself in a position to where you're guessing, and then your guess gets an advantage over what the reality of the situation was. So there's a lot of things they're going to discuss. That's one thing I haven't really seen brought up anywhere that I think that they should consider making a change, as far as the way that they do replay reviews.
I love it. I remember in the aftermath, we were having that discussion, and I totally agree. I think there's a lot of times the head official will come up to the coach, and if you had him all mic'd up, he'd be like, hey, my guy didn't see it. He just made a call like that. We screwed it up. I think that happens a lot. And if there's a way out of that where you could just say, you know what, let's get it right. I have no idea. And there's a lot of times that happens, and just make that call and then go get it right from the get-go. And you don't have to have the definitive overrule. You don't have to have the clear case. I think that makes a ton of sense.
So you stop a ref from forcing themselves into call number one, which then is going to be held to a different standard when you toss it to the replay review.
Mm-hmm. Like, you can see, like, I posted the video in my column of the end of the Miami-Virginia Tech play where the officials are getting together and they're talking. They have no idea. Like, you could read it in there, like, what'd you see? I don't know. And then, like, the camera pans away to Miami celebrating, but then they go back and Virginia Tech is celebrating because they ruled it a touchdown, just because they're like, we got to call something, touchdown. So, I mean, I think in the end they got it right, which is more important than anything, but just don't put them in the situation. Like, I feel like a lot of the ideas when it comes to rule changes, and we'll discuss, like, Bud has been talking about it forever. Now, this is one of the things they'll be discussing, where to keep players from faking injuries, make them sit out the rest of the series. But part of the job needs to be, instead of just giving them more calls that they have to make the officials' jobs easier. Don't put that pressure on them. I think we need to take more of a stance of that. Don't put them in situations where they're having to guess, where they're having to, like, just, split hairs about what actually happened in a sport in which everybody is moving at very high speeds and colliding constantly. So just do something like this that would make their job easier. You have all these cameras. You've invested the money into it. Use it. And when we've seen in baseball this spring, they're starting to use the automated, strike zone thing where you can challenge the call. Technology exists, man. Start using it any way you can to improve the product you are putting on the field.
Danny, where are you at on the faking injuries part of this? Do you think that there are sensible solutions that we could see come out of this? Because Tom's right. Like, there are maybe other things that could actually make the game better, but it does seem as though there is a lot of conversation among fans, among coaches coming out of the coaches convention, and so much more that's really, sort of taken aim at the faking injuries as something that needs to be legislated out of the game.
I think we all want it, but I don't know how realistic it is because we're talking about injuries and how uncomfortable it could be if you thought a player was faking and it turns out, what if he was faking a concussion, and like you made that accusation? That would not go over well, nor should it. So that's the dynamic that I don't know how to unfold. Now, this is where I think you handle this, maybe not even during the game, and you kind of take the route that Sankey did during the season, which was, the sternly worded letter with the threat of fines. But, what's the appropriate fine for a coach that's making $10 million? $100,000 is not that significant when you think about what it could mean for a win or a loss that could get you into a playoff. So I honestly don't know what the solution is. I think there's steps in the right direction. Like, I do like the idea, if you see a player that's faking or goes down, he has to sit out that series. But then you probably have to make the rule for any player that's hurt has to stay out that series. Like, even if faking or not, like, you have to come out for that series, and you can buy him back in. If you want to use your timeout, you can get him back on the field. But it's really subjective when it comes to injuries. So it's almost, and I think that's what Sankey's letter had said too, is like, collectively, we need to recognize what this does to the sport, the damage it's doing.
Yeah, it's not an easy situation to fix because the concern is players who are injured will just not go down because they don't want to have to sit out the rest of the series.
Right.
So that's the tricky situation you have to manage. And then also too, like, I've seen suggestions where it doesn't apply to quarterbacks because you never see the quarterback falling down and faking an injury to slow stuff down. It's always a defensive player.
We're talking about almost exclusively like the idea of fake. And for those of you like who haven't quite followed this, defensive player, a defense is getting run down usually by an up-tempo, no huddle offense, and in faking the injury, you now have created a pause. You've taken away all of the rhythm that offense has been able to develop. You're giving your defense a chance to catch their breath. You have created a timeout without having to call a timeout like that. Those are the situations that we are talking about. And as the up-tempo, no huddle offenses have continued to just become so much more commonplace, that so has also this sort of roundabout way of slowing them down with having usually a big 315-pound defensive lineman. Just all of a sudden he looks to the sideline. Yeah. And then he's, and so it hits the deck.
And there have been examples that are so egregious where you literally see the player get up, start walking around, sees the coach who gives the signal, and he drops in a heap. Like, for those circumstances, that's when I think you go with the heavy fine, and maybe it's the same as storming the field. It's, and I would start at $250,000 and say every time it doubles, so if you get caught twice, it's going to be 500. If you get caught a third time, it's $1 million. Like, we cannot afford this. But I do think you have to have concrete evidence that there is some operation in place that says from the sideline, go down. It's specific. But that's the way I think you would handle the most egregious examples.
Our friend Tika Frog, can we fix fake injuries by making players sit out the rest of the series? Seems like coaches would pay that. Are there any cons? Who's arguing against sitting out the rest of the series? Is it the player concern that you brought up, Tom?
Yeah, it's players who are hurting, not going down because they don't want to sit out the rest of the series. Right. Because you will see that.
And I think every player's had their wind knocked out of them where you might have to leave for a play and you cannot breathe. It's like scary. Like you cannot breathe and you just need a play and you want to come back on like that, or a legitimate series. Like sometimes you roll your ankle a little bit and you think it's worse and you might be able to play through it. Like there definitely are injuries that you can recover from quickly. And once you get checked out, you can go back on the field, but that's the thing. That's the rub. It's like there is an issue because it is injuries. It's subjective and different players respond differently, and I do like the fact you could use a timeout, but what if it's, 2 minutes left in the game and you're trying to save your timeouts and your best player. I mean, I guess that's when it becomes a little bit more strategic of when you would use the timeout to get him back and when you wouldn't. Because if it was a quarterback, you could definitely, like we were talking about, if it was a quarterback who got the wind knocked out of him and had to leave, then you could say, all right, we're going to use our timeout, get him back on.
Okay. How many individual defensive players do you think are truly irreplaceable under that game pressure? I don't think it's one per team at the power conference level.
No, I think that there are plenty of guys that you'd be comfortable sitting out for the rest of the series if you had to.
Yeah.
Right.
And a part of it too, another aspect I've seen argued against it is like, because now that you have the helmet communication, what happens if your green dot gets hurt and he has to sit out the rest of the series?
Well, they do have a backup green dot though, right?
Yep.
Okay.
But like, what if he gets hurt?
I don't know. There are it's great in theory, but there are complications to it that we might not be considering that could then become a bigger problem. So like, it's annoying, and it is, as far as like the competitive spirit, it kind of pisses you off, but is it truly a problem?
I mean,
that requires a rule change.
Shame. Let's just shame them.
Yeah, okay? Shame them publicly.
Shame them.
And you know what? TV broadcasts do it. They'll show you the replay of the guy laying down, but they don't care. I mean, obviously, you're trying to help your team win. And if your coaches want you to lay down so that way you can give your teammates a breather and figure things out, that's all these guys care about.
Yep. I was gonna pitch. I was like, would it be overly complicated to, instead of doing the rest of the series until a first down resets the drive? That's overly complicated, right?
What if you just do it? It's a 10-yard penalty.
Oh, it's a judgment call.
Yeah.
Hey, Faker, back it up. Be like 10 yards.
Flopping, or just, I don't know, 5 yards. Every injury you lose, offense loses 5 yards. Defense
don't get hurt.
Don't get hurt.
In this incredibly violent game. Do not get hurt.
So I'm saying that's the problem. Like, this is football. People are going to get hurt. You can't really punish teams for players getting hurt.
See, that's why they did it to begin with. That's why I think the best scenario is handling it not during the game, because it would slow it down if they go looking. And you could even present the evidence, say it's on you guys to police it yourselves. But if you catch somebody, send it to us, send the evidence, and we'll hammer them with a fine. And I think the fine, again, has to be significant, and it doubles every time.
And also, let's not forget, we have seen players say they're injured and sit out the rest of the season.
Right.
That soft tissue injury.
Ow, my hammy.
I tell you what. It is crazy when your NFL draft stock and your win-loss record lead to those soft tissue injuries. It's wild the way that happens. All right. Oh, any other anything else? Any other rules we should be taking a look at?
They are. I mean, I think that you will see some stuff with the replay. From what I've heard, everybody's always crying about targeting. They will not be making any changes to targeting. They are actually happy with what they're seeing because of the targeting. And they'll point out there have been fewer targeting calls year by year. But Bud just doesn't want to ever see a targeting call.
Well, I'm just saying, but like, let it happen in an instant classic college football playoff quarterfinal that everybody is watching on New Year's Day. And it seems like it's the biggest issue in the world. But the season as a whole, it did feel like it was less littered with those kinds of targeting calls that had us on a Monday and upon further review talking about targeting all the time. So that Danny,
I want to see less targeting in general.
Right.
They're doing, I mean, it's fine. I don't love it.
I
wish they would actually do subjectivity. I think this is one where you can kind of tell. But again, like, then I would say if you're going to suspend a player for a half, I would go and look at it and review them. Like, we've got enough money, enough people that can be dedicated to monitoring the safety of the game to say, you know what, during the game, call the penalty, make it 15 yards. You can waive it off if it's clearly not, but then you have time to go take your time subjectively, have 3 people, 1 person, whatever it is, say, was this a guy who was headhunting and it's worthy of a suspension, or was this incidental contact that just happened to be head to head? And I'd be okay if they did that and said, you know what? It was just a football play. It happened, and it was bad, and we had the 15-yard penalty, and we're not going to suspend him for the next half. We're going to let him play. And then you know what? There might be some games where it's a whole game. That was so bad. That was egregious. It's not just a half. It's going to be a whole game he has to sit out.
Mm-hmm.
And then like take your time with it when you have film and you don't have to wait for it during the game.
One thing they will be discussing, Jerry B reminded me of, they're not going to change the overtime format, but they are going to discuss the timeouts in overtime. Remember Kirby at the end of that, George was calling a timeout every single time, and it might just be you get like a one timeout.
One timeout, 2 overtimes.
Yeah.
I wish they would move it back. That's the only tweak I would make. Yeah, the 2-point conversion used to bother me. It felt a bit fluky, like, and you're just getting into 2-point plays. But if you moved it back
to the 40, you'll see fewer 2-point convert. Yep,
you'd see those games end a lot faster.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so go back to the old overtime rules, but instead of getting it at the 25, you get it at the 40?
No, I don't care.
Keep the third,
the same rules.
You can still go to the OT, the 2-point shootout, but if you move it to the 40-yard line, you won't get to that third overtime nearly as often.
The game will end in either the first or second overtime.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I like that. God.
Yeah, that's always been my biggest, like, why don't we just move the ball back? That would solve so many of these problems.
Yep.
I mean, the greatest early overtime sequence, of course, being Tua Tagovailoa taking a 16-yard sack, but then stepping up and delivering after that a 41-yard strike to Devonta Smith in the end zone to walk it off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the easy thing. He just needed to back it up to the 40.
Needed more space to let that arm work.
More space. Let's go. All right.